Hello and welcome to a History Film Forum discussion of the new and important film Attica by Stanley Nelson and Tracy Curry. I'm Chris Wilson, Director of Experience Design at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. We've looked at many brilliant films that explored and many times provided shocking and relevant memories and reminders of our history, and none more so than this film on the Attica prison uprising that occurred 50 years ago this fall. This film debuts on Showtime in November 2021, and we're here to discuss the history and the filmmaking with its creators. Now, remember, if you like this History Film Forum content, please like and subscribe down below. And we want this to be a conversation, so if you want to talk about the film or the history or have other films or topics you'd like us to address, please let us know in the comments. And explore our other videos on the History Film Forum playlist on the National Museum of American History YouTube channel. I'm really pleased to welcome Stanley Nelson back to the History Film Forum and the Smithsonian. Stanley typifies what we started the History Film Forum to do, to explore how history is presented on the screen. Stanley has become the chief documentarian of the African American experience. His work has been so important in illuminating the underexplored American past. And besides being a MacArthur Genius Fellow, winning nearly every award in broadcasting, including 5 Primetime Emmy Awards and Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Emmys, the Peabody Awards, and the International Documentary Association, Stanley has also been closely aligned with the Smithsonian. When we created the Smithsonian's National Youth Summit program in 2011, we focused on his film Freedom Riders, which was later added to the National Film Registry from the Library of Congress. We presented another National Youth Summit based on his film Freedom Summer, and at one of our History Film Forum programs at the Smithsonian, we screened his Black Panthers, the Vanguard of the Revolution. And Stanley was very much involved with some brilliant projects with our sister museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So it's a pleasure to welcome Stanley and work with him here again. Tracy A. Curry is a national award-winning producer, director, and writer of powerful stories with more than 2 decades of experience in creating compelling, in-depth narratives for multimedia platforms, including long and short-form documentaries. She has served as a producer on several national cable shows, and Tracy's work has been featured across a variety of networks, including PBS, ESPN, MSNBC, BET, HGTV, TV1, CNN, and ABC. Tracy's co-director and producer of this film, Attica, which was selected as the opening night documentary for the 2021 Toronto International Film Festival. Tracy is also the founder and owner of her own production company, Be Free Media, named to honor her hero and mine, pioneering journalist Ida B. Wells, and her newspaper, the Memphis Free Speech, which was burned in 1892, following Wells' groundbreaking expose of lynching in the South. So welcome both of you.
Thank you.
So as I mentioned at the start, we've had the pleasure of working with you, Stanley, on numerous films on the civil rights movement and different aspects of that, from the Freedom Rides, again, to Freedom Summer, to the Black Panthers. But I want to ask you about kind of history and memory of the movement. I started at the Smithsonian in 2004, so the 50th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and then we moved on through many, many 50th anniversaries. And then it almost seemed like we went back to going through 60th anniversaries of those same moments, but never really, looking at the period afterwards. And you released this film and screened in Toronto on the actual anniversary of the Attica prison uprising, the 50th anniversary. So can you talk a little bit about why you think it's important to remember this later period, and what we should take away from memories of 1971 and the period following the traditional ending of the civil rights movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, this period has not gotten the attention of the civil rights movement. I think, one of the reasons why is there weren't so many clear victories. There weren't so many happy endings. And now African Americans all have the right to vote, or things like that. It's just not the positive endings, and it's a little more complicated, and some of the events are a little stickier than the '60s, and so I think that in some ways they have not gotten that much attention. But we're at the 50-year mark for 1971, so maybe they will get attention as we hit 50-year mark in 72 and 74 and 76.
Right. Yeah. It reminds me of a conversation I had with historian Eric Foner once when we were talking about Civil War versus Reconstruction. He said sort of it would be telling how we remember Reconstruction versus how we remember the Civil War. And I think the same can be said about this period. Let's talk a little bit, before we get into the history, let's talk a little bit about the filmmaking. This film was shot during COVID, but it doesn't look like it was, Tracy. Your interviews are beautiful and they're so powerful and emotional. Can you talk about both the technical aspects of making this film and then what it was like working with these men to relive this trauma?
Yeah, sure. So from the technical side, COVID and the pandemic is definitely sort of the elephant in the back of the room. I mean, when everything sort of the world fell apart, I think all of us, not just in this film, but all of us were in production trying to figure out, can we move forward? How do we move forward? How can we do this in the way that is as safe as possible, not just for the people that are being interviewed, but for the entire production crew? And so there was certainly some sort of time spent kind of thinking about that. And, in my conversations with the people that we interviewed for the film, I certainly kind of gave them the room to say no if for whatever reason they felt uncomfortable because of the pandemic. Obviously, this is something that happened 50 years ago. So pretty much everyone that we interviewed for the film were in an age range that makes you especially vulnerable to COVID. And then there was just sort of the logistical questions of sort of how do we make the space safe when we're in a physical environment. So there were masks. We kind of experimented with some plexiglass shields. That was a little weird to talk to people that way. So we sort of did away with that. We used large spaces. We had a minimal amount of crew in the spaces. So we did everything that we could to really maximize the safety. And then at some point, it just was sort of untenable to do a lot of traveling. And so we had to shoot the interviews remotely, which was the first time I had done that. And it's a little bit of an awkward experience, particularly for subject matter like this. Obviously, it's preferable to be present with someone when you're really engaging with them over difficult memories or traumatic subject matter. But ultimately, it really worked out. We set it up so that the interview subject and the crew, the DP, the sound person were together. And then I was here in my home talking to them through the screen. And I think to the credit of everybody on the team that kind of worked so hard to pull all this off, I don't think that you can really tell the difference between the ones where I was in the room with the people and the ones where we were sort of talking through the screen. So that worked out so well. And then in terms of just the actual conversation with the men, not only the men, but also the people who were observers at the prison, as well as the family members that you see of the guards. None of these conversations were easy. As you can imagine, this is a defining trauma of most of their lives, and it's not something that people were necessarily initially jumping to kind of want to talk about. And so there were a lot of conversations before we ever put a camera in anybody's face, just sort of getting comfortable, being as transparent as possible about our intentions and what we intended to do with these slices of their lives. But I found that once we sort of got past that initial getting comfortable point, so much of what happened 50 years ago was just right there beneath the surface, and people really, really did want to talk about it. And I think some of it is that these people never really got real justice, none of them, the prisoners, the families, the hostages from the state of New York. And so I think in some ways talking about it maybe feels something close to that for a lot of these folks. And so we were able to really connect. And then my job was just in the interviews to sort of set the stage for them to be able to speak and kind of guide the conversation where we needed it to go, but then really kind of step back and allow them that space to talk about everything that they experienced.
So getting into the history then, the one of the themes that really comes through, and I think comes through from my work in studying the civil rights movement, is protest and activism really can result in societal changes, but also results in changes within people. And you heard a lot about the prisoners feeling that and learning and starting to believe that it was okay for them to be rebellious, okay for them to say no, and getting more bravery and getting more ability to stand up for themselves. Can you start with a little bit about what that journey was like, and maybe the story of George Jackson, which really started to inspire these folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can't separate what happened at Attica, the rebellion, from the times, and we really wanted to set it in the times, but not not spend way too much time on that, because again, the film is about Attica. So we wanted to set it in the time, which was the time of the Black Panthers, which was the time, a little bit after, but still, Malcolm X had a huge influence on African Americans and the country in general, and prisoners. And then George Jackson, who was incarcerated in California himself, and became kind of a beacon, an idol for so many people who were in prison. And when George Jackson was killed, in some ways, as we show in the film, it was the inciting incident in the rebellion. For the prisoners, they said, okay, that's just enough.
Can you talk a little bit more about, for instance, religion and the Nation of Islam, and how that and the different communities that existed inside the prison in terms of prisoners?
Yeah, I mean, well, the Nation of Islam was huge in prisons, because the Nation of Islam went to prisons and actually recruited people in prisons. And so there was a huge Muslim population, a growing Muslim population in the prisons. And one of the things that we talk about is that the prisoners at Attica were fed on 21 cents a meal, 63 cents a day, and which was nothing, but also they were fed pork all the time. And so that there was no choice for the Muslim prisoners but not to eat or to buy whatever they could, get out of the commissary. So that was just another point of contention among the prisoners of Attica.
Now, on the other side of this kind of community, we've got the prisoners, but then there's also the guards and the town. And today we are experiencing issues with for-profit prisons coming into existence and so forth. And Attica was a state prison, but you make the point in the film that the town of Attica was it was the industry. It was a prison town, and many people who worked in the town, that they had jobs related to the prison. How did that? Can you talk a little bit about that community and I guess also the relationship between how that affected how the guards and the prison administrators felt about the incarcerated individuals and how they would treat them?
Sure, Tracy.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, Chris, the prison very much was the economic engine of the town, but it was also some way the culture of the town kind of coalesced around this identity of being a prison town. I mean, you had generations of fathers, sons, uncles, brothers that all worked at Attica prison. And my sense was that to some extent, it was a point of pride for people. A lot of these were, male-led households where, if you worked at the prison, you were able to provide for your family. It was a good living. You could make a pension. So there's this economic aspect, but there also is just sort of this culture of the people that lived in Attica Village, kind of identifying themselves as prison folks, prison town, like this is what they did. And as we see in the film, it kind of fueled this dynamic in the prison and these tensions in the prison, because although, you know, in some ways the people that worked at the prison and the prisoners were as close as any people could be in terms of proximity, because they're all together in this prison. But on the other hand, they're a world apart. And you hear someone in the prison, someone in the film talk about how the prisoners might as well be aliens to the people that worked at the prison, because here we have the prisoners, many of them are from New York City, a lot of them are from upstate, but cities also, from Buffalo and from Rochester. And these two groups of people don't know anything about their worlds. You add to that racial animus, and it fueled, it was not the determining factor, but it certainly fueled the frustration that kept building up until it bubbled over on the day of the uprising.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that it's really important that we understand that you know, Attica wasn't unique. You know, that prisons are built, you know, far away from the cities. Prisons are built so that we don't have to see them, so that the prisons and the prisoners are out of sight, out of mind, and that it's typical. It's still going on today, where prisons are, you know, by and large, located where we won't see them.
Yeah. So so the issues that you hear in the film over and over again from the prisoners, from the inmates, are pretty simple. That they want basic necessities of being human beings. They want to be treated as they're human, as opposed to these, say over and over again, that they were treated like dogs. Can you just take us through, you know, how this started for those who haven't seen the film? Kind of talk through, you know, what both what they were kind of seeking and, you know, and how the uprising began.
Yeah, so they were looking for real change in the prison. I mean, ultimately, they end up with this after sort of several rounds of back and forth and kind of being helped by the observers. They end up with this list of 30 demands. And yes, that included basic sanitary things like the toilet paper, the showers. There were also some labor demands. Attica was a prison where if you were an able-bodied person, you had to work. And so there was a metal shop where they made desks and chairs that would be used in state offices. I believe there was some sort of textile facility where one of the prisoners told me he asked for another job because he had a respiratory infection from so much lint being in the air, and the prisoners made pennies. So one of the demands was they wanted a minimum wage. You hear them talk about some of the brutality they experienced at the hands of the guards in the prison. So some of them wanted some sort of justice for that violence that they experienced. Can these guards be prosecuted? So they were really looking to make institutional changes inside of this prison, and that was reflected in the list that they ultimately submitted, and which was agreed to with the exception of amnesty, which, as we know, became sort of the defining point after the death of the guards.
And so, you know, when they take over much of the prison, they take over the prison. I mean, there is violence. You know, I was struck by, you know, people saying, I mean, the inmates saying that again, the guards were brutally violent toward them and you know, in addition to things, as Stanley mentioned, the lack of food choices and the lack of respect and so forth. But you know, but they don't, there's not wholesale violence sort of from the inmate side in the initial takeover. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what the point when they sort of got the prison taken over and how they then started to present these demands and enter into negotiation?
Yeah, I mean, at first, you know, there was, you know, violence. I mean, they took over the prison, you know, by force. And, you know, one guard, Quinn, was really badly hurt and taken out of the prison. But very quickly, the prisoners start to organize and realize that the only leverage they have is the 30-something hostages, the guards and the civilian hostages that they have. And that if they kind of treat them decently, then it'll go a long way to holding off the forces that are all aligned against them. So very quickly, the violence kind of stops, and the prisoners actually vote for the Muslim contingent to guard the hostages, and that's what they do. And the prisoners become very proud of the way that they treated the hostages, and that they did not inflict any more violence on the hostages as the rebellion went on.
So another point you really show very strongly in the film is the focus on the politics of law and order through the Goldwater campaign, Reagan's California gubernatorial campaign, and eventual rise to national prominence, and then certainly into Nixon, who we see using this phrase and talking with Rockefeller about this. We see the rise of this idea, this phrase of law and order, and this strategy and way to discuss and work around issues of race without saying it moving into American politics, and it has never left. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk first and then let Tracy add to it. I mean, Richard Nixon was really elected on a law and order ticket. If you look at his, campaign ads, which still exist, and you probably get them on YouTube. I mean, they're very scary, and he talks really, about law and order, that we believe in law and order, and we will bring this country back. And in a way, it's kind of the end of the 60s, kind of the freedom of the 60s, and now, this country turns, to this law and order piece, and it was huge, and that's kind of what the buzz saw in some ways that the prisoners and the rebellion ran into.
Yeah, I think Chris, what's really striking to me in that call between Nixon and Rockefeller is how almost thirstily Nixon wants the story to be about the Blacks, right? Like, this is the first thing that he goes to. And of course, we know that narrative is what he ultimately used to win the presidency. The whole deal with law and order was that there had been uprisings and rebellions in the city, similar to what happened at Attica, that looked terrifying to white people. And so Nixon said, we need law and order, and if you make me the president, I will get this unruly Blackness in order. And so in that call with Rockefeller, we see him attempting to kind of go back to that same well again. If you listen to what the prisoners said about themselves in the yard, when they were in Attica, they sort of separated themselves and segregated themselves for survival into these groups, but they were very clear that at least for those 5 days, they embraced this political identity as prisoners. And you hear prisoners of all races sort of express that when they're talking to the cameras in D-Yard. However, when Nixon is talking to Rockefeller and you see them sort of trying to craft the narrative, they're trying to make this a story about Blackness and criminalizing Blackness and disorderly Blackness so that we can then justify what ultimately happened to end the uprising on the 13th. And so I thought that was so interesting because it worked for Nixon the first time, and you can see the wheels kind of turning like, well, let's try this again. And they would have almost gotten away with it if not for the forensic science and Dr. Edlin telling the truth about what actually happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that Tracy's saying is really fascinating, and that's that Nixon and Rockefeller never talk about Black people in public, right? You never hear with the Law and Order commercials with Nixon, and then they never mention Black folks, African Americans, but when they're on the phone together, which they think is a private call, but fortunately for us, Nixon was so paranoid that he's taping all his phone calls. The first thing that he says is like, "Was it the Blacks? Was the Black involved? Were there any white people killed?" The extent and kind of out there-ness of his racism is just shocking.
And well, I think as you show in the film, and as Tracy just said too, it really is clear that it's crafting a narrative that's really calculated. I mean, that it's, that it's about promoting fear, but and even with the guards, the recordings that you have there, it's not very far under the surface. I mean, what's sort of driving them forward. I was also curious whether, were there guards still alive that you may have been able to interview, and what that negotiation was like if you attempted to. But then also I was really struck by and shocked by the radio communications that the guards had, where we hear them talk about the biggest, blackest, prisoner in front of them and so forth, and wondered how you found some of that material.
Yeah, so I'll start with the last part first. The footage that you heard is actually in the New York State Archives, and those were state troopers that they had positioned, on the rooftops and the catwalks, who were reporting everything that happened. Interestingly enough, after the 13th, it was actually the state troopers that investigated themselves, and they sort of disposed of any evidence that would have incriminated them, but collected all the sort of little makeshift weapons that would have incriminated the prisoners on the 13th. As far as the guards are concerned, yes, absolutely. It was our intention to hear from every person who was touched by what happened on those 5 days, and certainly the guards who were hostages. Some of them were civilian employees and not guards, were those people. I made just as much of an effort to try to reach out to them as I did to the prisoners and the other people you hear in the film. Ultimately, had planned to shoot 3 of the guards who were hostages, because obviously they have their own perspective on what it was to be, a hostage out there. Whatever the prisoners' intentions were, it was terrifying for them. And a couple of days before we were supposed to film them, they changed their minds and declined to be in the film. So.
Can you talk a bit about the importance of journalists and the media in this story at the time, as well as providing an understanding of the story for us 50 years later?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there's at least 2 parts in the journalist participation. One was that, on the first day, the prisoners said that they want the press to come in, and they invited the press to come in. And so one of the things that's so striking about the story and so striking about the film is the footage that exists, that because they invited the press in, and the press was filming the whole time, and the press was, filming with microphones as the prisoners made speeches, and they argued with the observers about what they wanted and their demands and why they were there. And, there's footage of them, digging the latrines and building tents and passing out food and organizing. So, one of the great things for us as filmmakers is that there was so much incredible footage, as this rebellion went through, day 1 through 5. I think that, one of the places where the press really let the whole event down was day 5 and after the retaking of the prison, where the press really just took for granted what was said, that the prisoners had slit throats and had killed people, and didn't really act as journalists, but just acted as parrots to the state. And that was really a letdown by the press. But Tracy, you want to add to that? Because I know you're...
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think that particular example is really instructive in terms of what we're kind of dealing with today about the perils of access journalism. In the case of Attica, you had one mouthpiece and one official voice from the prison that was providing information, the official story to all of the press that had gathered outside. And of course, when you get access to those voices as a journalist, that should be the floor, not the ceiling for your reporting. You should continue to ask more questions. And it really was a massive failure, and I say this as a journalist, of journalism, because the story that the prisoners killed 10 hostages, it ran in AP, it ran in the New York Times, I mean, all of the major news outlets, and it was the story. John Johnson, who you see in the film, is one of the few exceptions who said, I didn't see it, so I'm not saying it. And he actually experienced some professional repercussions because of that. And of course, as we saw in the film, that was corrected by Dr. Edlin the next day. But of course, because of the primacy effect, the first story that you hear, and particularly when the first story is has this kind of stickiness of prisoners slit the throats and killed the hostages, that's the one that tends to stick. So although the story was corrected the next day, there's still a lot of people to this day who still believe, because of that first initial reports, that the prisoners killed 10 hostages in the prison. And so I think, like Stanley said, as much as this is sort of almost a triumph of the power of media, because in many ways we made the film, we're still talking about Attica because we could see it. I think it also is a lesson about, you know, the ways that the media can fail us when it's too reliant on those powerful institutional voices.
I think
It
also
seems
one of the things that happens is that, you know, the last day, the press, you know, the networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, are not allowed into the prison, you know, and so you know, the color photography stops, you know, the beautiful 16mm color photography stops, but the New York State surveillance was still up in the towers, you know, shooting that video in black and white, and that's one of the most amazing, you know, pieces of footage, you know, that that survives is the actual, you know, attack on Attica. We see the actual attack, and we see the aftermath of the prisoners being tortured, systematically tortured, and they just keep filming it. I don't know why exactly they kept filming, but fortunately they did, and the evidence is right there in front of us.
I want to get to that, but I also want to get to one of the sort of legacy issues that that Tracy brought up as you've been making this film and you know and talking about it to people. Do you find, Tracy, you mentioned people to this day believe some of the stories of the violence of the prisoners, you know, against the hostages and so forth? I feel like that one of the insidious results of the law and order ideal and phrasing and so forth, and really strategy, takes away, you know, the humanity, takes away any sort of obligation on the part of the state to treat people, you know, treat people fairly because they're prisoners, because they're criminals, because, you know, we hear to this day, you know, if you just comply with the orders of the police. I think that's probably helps to keep that story, make that story stick over the years. But did you find many people say, you know, believing, or how many people did you find sort of believing the overall narrative that the prisoners were violent towards the hostages and had killed many hostages?
It was just sort of something that I heard anecdotally,
Okay.
just sort of talking to people, some of the folks in Attica, that sort of is the understanding among some people to this day, that original narrative.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I think that also one of the important things too is that, you know, most people don't think about why the prisoners rebelled, and I think that kind of gets to your point. You know, it's almost like people think, well, of course they rebelled, of course they weren't happy. You know, they were prisoners, but no, you know, the prisoners in Attica had specific reasons, and they were, you know, very legitimate. You know, they were getting one roll of toilet paper a month. They were getting beat by the guards. They had real legitimate grievances. And that's really what they wanted to correct. So I think that in many ways, the fact that you know, if you ask 10 people, you know, who know about Attica, if you ask 10 people, you know, why did it start? What was it about? You find very few people who can tell you what it was about.
right. So at the end, as we move toward the day 5 and into the takeover of the prison, you know, prisoners felt they were negotiating. right? And this didn't have to happen violently, did it?
No, it didn't. I mean, of course, we can all sort of Monday morning quarterback it and go through the shouldas, couldas, wouldas, but I think we make a good case in the film for if the governor had just come. And again, to be clear, as the observer said, they were not asking him to go into the yard with the prisoners. They were not asking him to talk to a prisoner. All they wanted was him to come and see for himself what they had seen, which was this growing hostility and rage of this massive law enforcement presence that had gathered outside of the prison. They had been there for days. They were tired. They were hearing lies that the prisoners were castrating and torturing the hostages. You have this, as we show, racial animus that already existed. This was the New York State Police, who are not necessarily experts in riot control or plans to kind of put down this kind of event. And so what all the observers were asking Rockefeller to do was to come and see what we see. Because if you see, they were convinced that if he saw what they saw, and some of that hostility was also directed towards the observers because they were perceived to be, advocates for the prisoners by the people outside, that it will be clear to you what will happen if you then send those people into the prison with guns and say, shoot. That is all that they were asking. And as we, again, show in the film, these were powerful people who had relationships with the governor. These weren't just some guy off the street calling him up. These are people that he has worked with before, that he knows, that he trusted. So I think you could make a strong case for, laying what happened on the 13th at Rockefeller's feet. He did not come, and ultimately he was the person that authorized the retaking that happened. And I think, again, shoulda, coulda, woulda, but I think it is a reasonable to speculate and to say that had he come, maybe they would have gone in. Maybe it still would have been violent, but I don't think it would have been this massive wanton orgy of violence, which ultimately happened that day.
Yeah, I think also, it's really important that we understand that there was no inciting incident. Nobody would claim that there was any inciting incident. It was more like, okay, we're fed up. We've listened to you prisoners, to you Black prisoners long enough, and we are just going to show you that we can take back the prison when we want. It's not like anything got worse. It's not like anything, the prisoners changed. It just was like, we are just going to do this because we can. And they did.
And probably we want to show that we did.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we have to also remember, as you state in the film, it was October in New York, and it was raining and it was getting colder and so forth. So, and then Stanley, you mentioned there's the takeover, but then there is what could only be called torture afterwards, and murder afterwards, after the initial wave of violence. You talk a little bit about that, those reprisals.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting things, for the people who have seen the film is that, the people are just as much outraged or more outraged of the things that happened after the takeover, where the people were killed, where it's just torture for no reason. And it's, it's illustrated. We see it very clearly. The former prisoners talk about it. One of the great things for us as filmmakers, is at the first day we show you that the prisoners building the latrines, digging the latrines, right? The day of the takeover, they make them crawl through the latrines, through human waste, for no reason except to humiliate them. They make everyone crawl on the ground like dogs, and curse them out as if they're dogs. And we see that, it's on film. We see them nude. They strip all the clothes off them and make them stand around like and sit around like this with their hands like that while they are nude. And this is like hundreds of people. And so this was just, torture after torture after torture. And it's after the prison has been taken back. There's no reason for it except for revenge and to torture people. And because they were thought of as less than human. You would not do this to someone you thought was human.
Another individual that I noticed in the film, Clarence Jones, Martin Luther King advisor, architect of his most famous speech, the Dream Speech, that he's involved. I think sometimes we forget that people working in sort of the traditional civil rights movement were involved in issues, all across the spectrum affecting, African Americans as well as other people. Can you talk about, his involvement, people like that, and how this was viewed as an issue with some of the Black leaders, across the country?
Yeah, I'll let Tracy do most of the talking here, but I just want to say that Clarence was close to 90 when we interviewed him, and he happened to come to New York, and we had like lunch with him, and we sat down in a restaurant and started talking to Clarence. And when he started talking, and he just had that memory, and Clarence is just kind of an otherworldly presence, and he started talking. And I just was like, okay, we got it, like we just got to, we got to get this guy on film, and we've got something that's really different. So, Clarence meant a great deal to me in getting him in the film, and he has an incredible memory, and he's incredibly passionate.
Yeah, I just can't say enough good things about Clarence Jones. The man is an American icon. He's a treasure. He should be treated as such. I really could just sit and listen to him all day. He told me stories about smuggling handwritten pieces of King's letter from the Birmingham jail out of the jail, so it could then be sort of typed and published. And his initial relationship with Rockefeller came when he'd gone to New York and he was trying to get money to bail King out. And so that's how he sort of first came to know Rockefeller and be in relationship with him. And what's interesting about Mr. Jones is that, as we show in the film, the prisoners had their list of folks that they wanted to come, and he was on that list because when he was publishing the Amsterdam News, prisoners would write letters to him and he would publish them in the paper. So he was known to them as somebody that would be an advocate and an ally, but he also was someone that the governor was interested in coming because of that relationship. So he sort of was very much, the advocate for the prisoner, but he's just lived so many lives and has moved through so many worlds in his lifetime that he was sort of trusted as a trusted person to go in by both sides.
So I kind of want to get into just kind of questions of what we should take away from the story, and I know in looking at history, there's never easy morals and simple takeaways. At the National Museum of American History, our mission really talks about wanting to kind of empower people with making them more comfortable about the complexity of history, that history and nostalgia are two different things. But I still want to hear a bit from you about, after working on this and bring this story to the public, kind of what our takeaways should be in your mind. Brian Stevenson, head of the Equal Justice Initiative, one of the things that he preaches is that when we have a society that has throwaway people, Stanley, you mentioned taking prisons and putting them in places that you'll never see, but a society that warehouses people that it deems unnecessary, it affects not just those people involved, but the whole society, and may spell its moral decline and doom. So, what can we take away from this story, and why do you feel like it's important for people to remember this period?
Tracy, you want to go first?
I think in some ways, Chris, it is very much a historical story and a historical moment, but I also, I I think that Attica is not a moment that kind of lives fossilized in history because of the connection to where we see the prison system is today, right? So I feel like I have to always remind people to remember what happens after with Rockefeller, that he, of course, goes on to become vice president, but not before he passes the Rockefeller drug laws, which are these draconian laws that are then replicated all throughout the country, and ultimately help fuel this explosion in not only the prison population, but the amount of prisons that are built here in the United States, and that ultimately lands us where we are today, where the United States has the largest population of prisoners in the world. And I think, you know, especially when it comes to the prison system, that we, and when I say we, I mean American people, are kind of allowed this luxury of knowing without seeing. And so you kind of know prison is a bad place and bad people go there, and I don't see what happens inside, and they send them away to these remote places, and I don't want to know. And I think what we're seeing right here in New York on Rikers, you know, there were these weeks of hearing these horrific stories about what was happening, but photos just came out a couple of days ago. And so when you know, but then you see, then you have to feel compelled to act. And I think that Attica is instructive that way. When you watch the film, at the end of the film, I think there's a level of knowing that I don't think that anybody walks away from this film feeling indifferent about what happened, versus if we told the story and didn't have the photos and didn't have the pictures. I think having to bear witness and having to see forces you to at least care and to feel compelled to act. And I think Attica can sort of be instructive for us in how we understand what's going on in the prisons today, because things have not really gotten better. Conditions are not great, but we're allowed the luxury of not seeing it. And so I think it sort of compels us to sort of ask those questions about what's happening, what we're not seeing, but might be going on inside the prison.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the film, you know, is really told by, you know, to a large degree by the people who were incarcerated in Attica. And you know, you see their faces, and you know, it's just a small thing, you know, because they're so powerful, and the images are so powerful of what happens and what's happening. But also you see their faces, you know, you see their humanity, you know, you see their intelligence as they talk about, you know, Attica and the prison conditions, and you can't help, you know, you believe them totally, and you can't help but think about their humanity. You know, thing I always talk about is that one line where the guy says, you know, the first night that he hasn't seen the night sky in 22 years, you know, and that's, you know, that's one of the most emotional lines in the film, because, you know, it just kind of, it just, whoa, it just shocks us, you know, that's the reality of it, and that's what prisons are for, you know, that we don't have to think about this guy. We don't have to think about why they're there. We don't have to think about also their lives that have, from the moment they were born, have guided them towards Attica, right? Every single thing has pushed them towards Attica, you know, and some people break out and don't follow that path, but many end up in prisons, you know, across this country, and hopefully, you know, that the film makes us think, at least for a moment, you know, or a few moments, about, you know, the people who are incarcerated in this country, you know, and the system where, you know, 2 million people are going to go to bed tonight without seeing the sky.
Well, Tracy Curry, Stanley Nelson, I think that's a great takeaway from this film. I hope that many people do experience the film when it streams, when it runs on Showtime in November of this year, and relive and better understand that period of our history, which I think will help in understanding our nation today. Tracy Curry, Stanley Nelson, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our members and partners at Smithsonian Associates, as well as our funder, Dan Manat and Democracy Films. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.